You're listening to sermons from La Cañada Congregational Church and Pastor Kyle Sears. Join us in person every Sunday at 10 a.m. in La Cañada for worship. You can find more information about our church online at lacañadachurch.org.
So I know many of y'all had a chance to meet my twin brother as you were coming into service this morning. He's in town this week. We're heading out to Yosemite this afternoon to do some hiking. And, you know, I love being a twin. I know I've shared some of my stories through this pulpit about what it's like being a twin, but we had such a common experience growing up that even beyond how we look or how we talk, it's fun to figure out the ways that we think alike as well. Our interests have diverged over the years. We don't really like the same TV shows or songs or anything like that, but our sense of humor is very much the same. Apologies if you don't quite connect with it. Our outlook on the world is very much the same. And if you spend time with us, you know that the differences that we have are mostly just surface level kind of things, that we really do act and think a lot alike. In our text this morning, Paul is going to encourage the church at Philippi to become of the same mind and how to find ways that we might join in a common sense of who we are and where we might be going. Even though we remain distinctly special as individuals, unique as individuals, there is some way we might become shared together. And so I want to read Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. If then there is any comfort in Christ, any consolation from love, any partnership with the Spirit, if there's any tender affection and sympathy, make my joy complete. Be of the same mind, have the same love, be in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or empty conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be grasped, but he himself, taking the form of a slave, assuming human likeness, and being found in appearance as a human, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And therefore God has exalted him even more highly and gave him the name that is above every other name, so that at the name given to Jesus, every knee should bend in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So Paul again is writing in hopes that his personal setbacks, like being thrown in prison, would somehow help the Philippian church deepen their commitment to faith and to one another. And he begins in this portion of the letter by saying, if you have found anything of value in the Christian experience, then fulfill the joy that I have found in you. If faith and hope and love and that connection and affection that you have discovered within this church is meaningful for you, then go one step forward and make my joy complete. And the way that Paul will imagine how his joy might be fulfilled, how the ideals of the church that he lists might somehow move toward a fuller conclusion, will be expressed in the unity of the people. From the beginning, many of the churches that Paul helped to start were in urban areas of the Roman Empire, attracting followers from different strata of society, men and women, slave and free, wealthy and poor, all scattered together and then brought into this one room. But across those formal barriers that existed across status and gender and nationality, what we found is that the message of Christ undermined those barriers. That Christ came to all with equal access and equal calling and equal responsibility offered, no matter where the people found themselves. Now we know how divisive it can be to put people in a room together and ask them, for example, to think about what we should have for lunch, much less what does it mean to be a church. We either keep it civil by not really talking about anything deeper than sports and weather and what we did this weekend or what we plan to do the next weekend, or we cozy up to our echo chambers that affirm our already made up minds about whatever it may be. But Paul is calling the church to aim higher, that as they gather, that they might consider what it means to be of the same mind, of the same love. And we do that, Paul will tell us, by decentering ourselves as the main character of the story. He says we should abandon conceit and ambition and instead think favorably of others. That we don't think so often of ourselves and where we fit within the hierarchy of whatever social network we might be in. Now, sometimes this idea of not thinking or thinking favorably of others rather than of ourselves can get translated into you have to think bad things about yourself. You have to think how low and worthless you are in the scope of humanity itself. And so we embrace this false humility. We ignore or we downplay our gifts or our perspectives. But the reality is that thinking too highly of ourselves or thinking too lowly of ourselves still has us thinking of ourselves. We have yet to decenter ourselves from that way of thinking. That we either are building our own selves up in our mind or we're casting ourselves down. But either way, we are missing the point of what it means. And so Paul is saying, what if instead we consider others? We think about their needs and give favor to their perspectives over and above our own. That somehow in that sense of laying down our life for the sake of others, putting ourselves in someone else's shoes, that we develop this sense of we rather than this sense of me. As a twin, a lot of my childhood stories are told with a we, because Kale and I did everything together. And so we jumped off of a house onto trampolines to see how higher we could get. We spray painted frogs and raced them across the pasture so they could easily be spotted. We called into the country radio station's Saturday night hotline, request line, and pretended to be a superintendent pining for our principal and making all the love song requests we could. Yeah, we did all of those things, and they became great stories to tell. But we also always looked out for each other. That when one was getting in trouble because of something they did, we figured out ways to hide that from mom so that she wouldn't find out. And in the church, there's that same level of trust. It's no surprise that Paul will adopt the language of family to talk about the church. That we should trust that others will look out for us as we look out for them. That so much of our society says that we should look out for us first. And when we do that, we have one person committed to watching us. But imagine in a congregation where we each commit to look out for one another, how many people we have supporting us. It's a lot more than one. That sort of social experiment, though, of trusting that someone's going to watch my back as I watch for theirs, is going to require things like patience and communication and forgiveness and grace and all of the other virtues taught by Christ. We become a laboratory of experimentation and practice and getting it wrong and making it right. In fact, Paul will say that the best way for us to engage in this little experiment of finding how we might share the same mind and same love, same heart and passion of where we are going is to imagine Christ, to adopt Jesus' mindset and see where that might take us. And so Paul will do what scholars are thinking is quoting an early Christian hymn beginning in verse 6 of this passage. Likely a hymn that is familiar to the Philippians, a song that they would have chanted with one voice together to illustrate what this one reality that they would live in might look like. And he says that though Jesus existed beyond time as we know it, held somehow within the mystery of God, that Jesus didn't jockey for titles and responsibilities that marked him as super important. That sometimes we're in a hurry to make sure that people know how important we are, either because of something we've already done, something we hope to do, but that I'm on my way up and you should recognize the talents that I bring. Several years ago, I had someone tell me that I should write a book, and I got it into my head that I could be important in my field if I did. And in seminary, I was reading through a theologian that had sparked my imagination about faith and theology and work, a man whose writings were prolific in the late 20th century. And I thought, this is the kind of person I want to be. And I would try to quote this guy to Erica, and she didn't care at all. And I would want to tell other people about this person, and they didn't care. They were like, who? Jurgen what? That's his name? He passed away this week in his late 90s. And beyond a few theology nerds, no one knows who this guy is. And I realized pursuing some sort of sense of legacy or name recognition is a complete waste of my time. Besides, with a last name like mine, people are going to think I'm associated with something completely different than theology anyway, so abandon it. Instead of clawing his way to the top is the way that Paul will quote. Instead of grasping what it means to be God, Jesus instead emptied himself of the divine attributes and became a human being. But even then, not even a remarkable one. Can you imagine living next door to God in the flesh for 30 years and never knowing? So that by the time Jesus makes his first sermon to the people of his hometown, they're like, wait a minute, aren't you that carpenter's kid? Sometimes we're quick to downplay the humanity of Jesus, making him out to be some sort of alien, weird as those who would withdraw from society because of their religious conviction. This superhuman who we could never do anything like Jesus taught because he was, in fact, God in the flesh, and so how should we even try? But I think it's helpful for us to imagine how Jesus would play outside with his friends and laugh at the same stuff we laugh at. That Jesus had a favorite meal, took pleasure in working with his hands. In all the ways that we exist as humans, Jesus did too. And I believe that because Paul tells us that the sort of mindset that Christ had is the same mindset that we can have, that it is achievable, that we can be good at something, that we can have our unique sense of being, and we can still be humble and caring and self-effacing. That Jesus willingly limited his prestige. In fact, what Paul will say is that he was submitting himself obediently to the pain of humanity, not only in our existence, but in our death. And not only in death, but in the shameful rejection that comes from others when you are put to death on a cross. How the power of state comes down to crush you, and you hang there naked and suffocating in front of everybody. Paul says this was an act of obedience. And this is what Jesus gets for being obedient. We're often quick to believe that acting obediently, especially in the divine realm, means that nothing but good can come from us. But sometimes our call to follow God takes us into threat and danger and poor reputation. At least for some. It's not universally true, but there are times when we might be called as individuals or as a congregation to obediently abandon the question of what could they do for us as we serve the poor or feed the hungry or welcome the stranger. Because again, we care for others and by faith trust that we will be cared for in return. And that crazy way of living, this foolish way of abandoning the rules that say it's a dog-eat-dog world and we better get while the getting's good, finds vindication ultimately in the life that God provides. Because after taking Jesus from the heights of heaven down to humanity and death, and even death on a cross, Paul says, therefore God has raised him up. That as low as Jesus will go, God will then lift him up, not through his human identity, but now through that divine identity that gives life to everyone. And that God will lift Jesus up into this new life that will capture not just Jesus's humanity, but all of our humanity. That somehow in the resurrection of Christ, the defeat of death happens and we all find ourselves brought into the wake of this new life. And this is a song that then taps into this ancient hope that was shared by the people of Israel, where every ethnicity on earth, every nation that could be imagined will find a common connection. The way the song says is that every knee will bow And every tongue will confess, not just humans, but every knee of those who live on the earth and above the earth and even under the earth will claim that Jesus is Lord of all. Will somehow find that as Christ is lifted up, all eyes are drawn, all hearts are brought together. This is a vision of a divine ruler that ascends to a throne and unites us rather than divides us. Some are content to have their Christian faith to be the dividing line. You are either in or you are out. You're a believer or an unbeliever. You are saved or you are lost. That is the total opposite of what Paul is teaching here. Remember, his aim is for the best expression of our Christian identity is unity, not in conformity, not in all of us becoming twins like me, and we have a church filled with duplicates. That's not, oh Lord, no, that is not what the vision of God is. Instead, each of us are who we are, and we recognize the gifts that exist in one another, the stories that are told, the ways of being and living and thinking and celebrating, and we celebrate those. And as a church or a community or even a nation or a world, that we are not whole until everyone is seen and loved and welcomed. That is the vision that Paul has for this church. And how might this small body of believers in this larger town, part of this ginormous empire, somehow embody the way of unity to show them beyond the walls that they too are invited to participate in that kind of life? The humanity of Jesus transformed the world, and the same mind can be in us. That our ultimate aim is Christ made known in us and then through us, so that others could see that they are invited to join in this song. The means by which we find this unity is Christ, this humanity that is a resounding yes to our humanity. That God would be willing to empty God's self to become human because it is, as Paul writes in some other places, a more fuller picture of who God is than when God puts on flesh. That our humanity is meant to be celebrated in all of its diversity. And when we celebrate it, it's what brings us together. The aim of God is not our perfection, but our connection with one another. I hope that we would know who we are by stop thinking so much about who we are and instead think about what we are called to do together. How we might consider others who are not here this morning, who might never be here in any of the mornings to come. How we might care for them, how we might open our lives up to them, how we might offer our privilege and our power and our resources in obedience for their sake, even if it means we lose every amount of reputation and security and satisfaction we hold, because we know that ultimately our lives are given for the sake of all, because we serve the one who has given his life for the sake of all. My hope is that we would find the mind of Christ to guide our imaginations toward a wider embrace of one another. Amen.